the passage that we're going to be using as a text in the Gospel of Mark. And I want you to stand with me as we read from the Gospel of Mark, the 16th chapter. And you can be standing if you like. And we're going to read the first 8 verses of the 16th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. It says, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go and tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. You may be seated. I'm sure that this is on, John, so I'm going to go ahead and stand back here this morning. But what I want to talk about this morning, as we look at Mark the 16th chapter, most of you are acquainted with the term insurmountable odds, aren't you? Have you ever come up with a situation, maybe in your own life, or maybe as you've observed whatever it is that's going on in our world culturally, and you have thought about, this seems to be a situation where there's just insurmountable odds. Well, what I want to talk about this morning as we look at Mark the 16th chapter is surmountable odds. And we look at the text and it shows us that with God, and when He is in it, when Jesus is in it, the odds are surmountable. Not insurmountable, but surmountable. The Romans are well documented. We talked about it the last time that I preached from the Gospel of Mark, when we talked about the whole book of Mark. And we talked about the Romans. They were a people, that were very direct. They wanted you, if they were in conversation with you, to get to the point and then get with it. And do what you say, and say what you're going to do, and be that kind of person. The Romans, by the way, could also be a very harsh and very cruel people. Roman crucifixion, that rings a bell with us, and that was one of probably the most cruel ways of executing a person in the ancient world, and probably of all time, Roman persecution, crucifixion. And there was a lot of things about the Romans. They could be harsh, and they would get to the point, and all of that type of thing. They were hard in some ways. Well, when Mark wrote his gospel about Jesus, he was directing that to the Romans. And so we find short statements, and we talked about that last time. Well, you know the story well, as we come to the last stages of the Gospel of Mark. And the Gospel of Mark begins to unfold, and we find how that Jesus was in Gethsemane. And when he was in Gethsemane, he was arrested. And they took him and they led him out to one trial after another through the course of the night. And so Jesus went through all these trials, and we know about Jesus before the Sanhedrin, and they brought, false charges against Jesus. We also know the story about how Peter then, as we go through the latter stages of the Gospel of Mark, Peter disowned Jesus himself, and he denied him 3 different times, and then the rooster, you remember, crowed. We know the story how Jesus stood before Pilate, and Pilate washed his hands of the whole situation. He said, "You do what you want to do with him." And of course the call rang out to crucify Jesus. Well, there on the cross, Jesus was mocked by the soldiers. And they threw dice and they cast lots to decide who's going to get his robe. There was a crucifixion and death and the burial. And now we come to this time upon which you and I base our faith and our hope today. The resurrection of Jesus Christ. We serve a God who is alive. He's not buried in some stale, cold tomb someplace in the Holy Land, but Jesus is alive, and we celebrate the resurrection.
Amen.
But what I want to suggest this morning is that we also find, as we go through this story of the resurrection of Jesus, in this short passage of just 8 verses, we are also faced with words that ought to encourage us in other ways today and strengthen our faith as we also face challenges and sometimes what seems to be insurmountable odds in our own lives. We all deal with them, don't we? We deal with them sometimes, it seems, every week of our lives. But we need to know that God's power is greater than your challenges. And He's alive. Look at our text. First of all, I want to point out to you man's dilemma. There is, first of all, in our text, man's dilemma. Notice verses 1 through 3. There are 3 women. The same 3, by the way, that are mentioned in chapter 15 and verse 40. Do you see it? There at the crucifixion, witnessing all of that, it says some women were watching from a distance. And among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, the younger, and Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs, and many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there, witnessing the crucifixion. Then we come to chapter 16, and on resurrection morning, see who we read again? The Sabbath was over, and there they are again. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. The same 3 that witnessed the crucifixion also came there on resurrection morning. It says they brought spices. Something we need to understand is their intention was not to embalm, because the Jews did not embalm like the Egyptians did. But they went out and they bought spices and they brought them, and normally what they would do is pour them over the body of the dead person. And they would take special care to especially pour those aromas and those spices over the face and the head, and its main purpose was to hold down the odor and some of that of the decaying body. And so that was the purpose of spices, and they were bringing those to the tomb to, they say, anoint the body of Jesus. It also says that they were coming early in those first 3 verses, and what early means to them is between probably 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the morning. Now, you know, at certain times, and depending on where you are living in the world, it may get lighter in some places earlier than it does in other places in the world. And so they were probably, no doubt, coming between 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the morning. Nevertheless, it says they were coming when it was early. And then they faced the challenge of the stone. Now, the stone that was rolled in front of the entrance to the tomb was something that was very large, and it was, of course, heavy. And as these three women are coming to the tomb, they are thinking about who in the world is going to roll the stone away, or how are we going to get that done? Because rolling it into place was pretty easy. It was kind of in a trough, and it would roll downhill and so forth. But getting that thing moved from in front of the tomb, that was a big project. How are we going to get that done? Well, here they come. They asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? The three women had a dilemma. They had a challenge. They had some obstacles to encounter as they went to the tomb where Jesus had been laid. You know what? You may be faced with an obstacle too today. Maybe you have the desire. You spent time in preparation, but it just doesn't seem to be happening. And everything is not falling into place the way that you thought it was going to fall into place, at least at this point in your life. And things have changed, and the obstacles seem daunting, and there you are, and there is stuff lying in your way to accomplish what it is that you want to get done. Insurmountable odds, or surmountable odds. Young people looking for a job. That's a bigger challenge today than it was 30 years ago. For young people getting out of high school and later getting a degree from college and looking for work, it's not easy. I work with a couple young social workers, and what's on their mind is what's on the minds of a lot of young women. Will I ever get married? One of them in an office where I work is 24 years of age. The other one is almost 30. She's 29, and it seems like regularly, well, not all the time, the way I said it sounds like all the time, but once in a while, I'll be in the office and I'll hear them talking about, getting married, and they don't have boyfriends, and this and that, and who are we going to, how's this going to work, and, we're ready. But we haven't found the right guy. And one of them's been engaged before, but she finally broke it off with him. And I told her one day, as we were talking about it, I said, well, good for you, because it's better now than later. And so we talked about that. And you know me, I can't resist. Every so often I'll jump into the middle of that conversation. And they're somewhat Christian. I say that in a way. But I talked to him about waiting for the right person to come along. But sometimes there are things in our lives that seem insurmountable. Maybe you're in the middle of one of those things now. You worked hard. You've been good. You played by the book. But circumstances happened and you can't control them. Maybe they downsized, you've looked for months. Maybe an accident happened or the unexpected health crisis and you didn't plan it. You tried to eat right, you exercised, and still it happened. Or in old age, the same thing happens. And you're faced with a dilemma. What you need to understand is take heart. You're not the first. And God is still in charge. And He is a big God.
Amen.
Don't ever forget it. Do you remember David? The little shepherd boy who was out watching the sheep. And there was a battle ensuing. And he was sent by Dad with a lunch to go see his brothers who were on the battlefront, and he was supposed to find out what was happening and then take word back to Dad. And so David, he packs up the lunch and he goes and he sees his brothers who are on the front lines. And he gets there and he sees this huge giant coming out and defying the armies of the Lord and ridiculing them and putting them down and insulting the God that he served. And he thought, this shouldn't be. And so this little boy, against these insurmountable odds, did what? He did what he knew was right, and he trusted God to see him through it. And he kept being who he was in God's sight. He took out a stone and put it in his sling, and he began to sling that thing around his head. And about that time, he let it go, and you know the rest of the story. The giant and his odds came tumbling down because he was faithful to what God wanted him to be. And he trusted in God. If you're facing insurmountable odds, stick in there. Keep trusting God. Stand for truth and what is right. And God will see you through. There's man's dilemma. There's also God's ability. There's man's dilemma. There's also God's ability. God is the mover of stones. He's the mover of stones. Whatever you are or wherever you are, God sees and knows what you need. One of my favorite Bible passages is here in the Gospel of Mark in the 6th chapter. And I mentioned it before, but you remember that in Mark, the 6th chapter, there is the feeding of the 5,000. And they thought, well, now, what are we going to do? Because there's all these people, and Lord, you're asking us to give them lunch or dinner. They said, send the crowd away. And Jesus said, no, you feed them. And so between those few loaves and those fish, Jesus began to multiply all of that, and he fed the 5,000. Well, after that, you remember Jesus went up on a mountainside to pray during the night, and he sent the disciples across the lake. Well, during it was late at night or early in the wee hours of the morning, the wind came up. You remember the waves got rough, and the disciples got scared, and they were beginning to wonder, well, where's Jesus? And if only he was here, then things would calm down. Well, he wasn't. What they didn't know is when they couldn't see him, he could see them. And they were out on the lake, and he was up on the mountain, and about that time he began walking across the water. And he calmed the waves, and the wind quieted down. And there he was. There's man's dilemma. There's also God's ability, and he can see you. Do you remember the story in John, the 1st chapter? And Nathanael, he was so impressed because Jesus told him late in the 1st chapter of the Gospel of Matthew that, Nathanael, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. And he did. When you were under your fig tree, also, by the way, he saw you too. He knows where we are. It's in the 10th chapter of John, where Jesus is talking about himself being the good shepherd. But I want you to notice verse 3 of John, the 10th chapter. In verse 3, it says, the watchman opens the gate for him. The sheep listen to his voice. They've heard it before. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. He knows your name. in the 14th verse of that 10th chapter of the Gospel of John, I am the good shepherd. I know